quarterfinals of the Champions League and third in La Liga. That's kind of where the base expectations are for them. And I still think that they're talked about as an underdog when I don't think they should be anymore.
Atlético Madrid, the best of the rest, I guess you could say, last season in Spain. They did challenge for the title at one point, but finishing 12 points behind Barca and 8 behind Real Madrid in the end. No trophies to show for it either. Here's our Spanish correspondent, Phil Kitromilides, on what Diego Simeone's men can do to bridge the gap to the Big Two next season.
So it's another summer of big spending for Atletico Madrid. Last year, there was a €180 million outlay investment in the squad, although the net spend was considerably lower because they did sell a lot of players. This summer, we're again past the €100 million mark already. Last season, it didn't work, and they finished up without any silverware when it looked like they could be competing on 3 fronts. Why did that happen? At the start of the season, they dropped a lot of points. They only won 5 out of their first 11 league games. Then they went on a great run and were top at Christmas before it all fell apart in the last 6 weeks of the season. But the start of the campaign was problematic for Atletico Madrid last year. And that felt it was a question of Diego Simeone not knowing how to fit in all these new players into the squad. And we saw it with Julian Alvarez. He was playing left midfield in some matches. He didn't know where to play Alexander Sorloth. It was problematic. Are we going to get those same problems this season for Atletico Madrid with new players coming in? Well, it feels like the players that they've signed this summer actually fit in quite well. And I think we know pretty much where everybody's going to play. If it's going to be a 4-4-2, no guarantee, but if it is a 4-4-2 like it was for the majority of last season, then Alex Baena should play on the left of the midfield 4. It should be Alvarez and Sorloth up front, as it was towards the end of last season. And then new signing Johnny Cardoso should come into the heart of midfield alongside Pablo Barrios, and then Ruggeri playing at fullback. So I think we might see a better start to the season for Atletico Madrid this year than we did last year, simply because it feels like the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that Diego Simeone has been handed fit a little bit better, or a little more obviously, than they did last year.
Chris, as Phil says there, they're continuing the trend that's been really the trend for the last couple of seasons, spending money, but as we saw last season, consistently behind Barcelona and Real Madrid. Who do you think is to blame for that trend?
Well, I would start with Diego Simeone, just because, let's be very clear, he's one of the highest paid managers in the world. It's an incredible amount of money to manage this football club. And ultimately, he's the one that's got to put this all together. And in theory, we're talking about all these purchases. There's no one at the football club that's doing anything without Diego Simeone's approval. So the idea of how to build this team has come through him. And how many players have come through the door? Talk about your Thomas Lemars, your João Felixes that didn't quite work out as creative attacking players in this team. He's the one that dictates everything. And the problem that you see over and over again for Atletico Madrid, for me, is going forward. They don't have enough going forward. You look at last season, Barcelona scored 102 goals, Atleti scored 68. And so I think if we're starting at any one place, it's on Simeone to get the tactics right and finally figure out a way to make this team enterprising going forward. Because at this point, they can no longer play the role of underdogs, because they're not the underdogs anymore. If you look at the transfer spend, and I appreciate Phil bringing up the net spend, they made some sales, but if we talk about the overall spend over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, it's a few $1 million off at, or a few million euros, dollars, whatever, off Real Madrid. And so when we're talking at that level of spending, way more than Barcelona over the course of the last few years. Barcelona brought up a bunch of academy kids and were able to figure it out, but they have an idea of how they're going to go into games and score goals, and Atleti just have not figured that out, and they just kind of end up in the quarterfinals of the Champions League and third in La Liga. That's kind of where the base expectations are for them. And I still think that they're talked about as an underdog when I don't think they should be anymore.
They have fell away at the end of last season, but as Phil pointed out, they were top at one point. It looked like they might win the title. They were genuinely in the title race. What were they getting right in terms of setup and the way the team were playing? And I know Real Madrid, we would think that they're going to improve next season. It was a down season, really, for them last year. But what were they getting right at that period, and what was Diego Simeone getting right in terms of tactics that then he wasn't able to keep going to the end of the season?
I think the biggest thing that they do when things go well for them is they find a way. That's kind of their thing. I don't think they were blowing teams away in many of those games, but they always seem to find a way. They get a late penalty, Simeone would bring on Alexander Sørloth, who had a great record off the bench, and he would change the game and they'd go and win something. But I don't ever really feel like, even in that period when they were grinding out results, draws, wins, and an incredible amount of results over that November, December, January period, I never really felt like, oh, well, this is a team that's going to go win La Liga now. They're in there. You have every chance because of your points total, but I never really felt that. And I think the biggest thing was just sort of a level of individual performance, figuring out where the pieces fit. And I think if we're talking about what happened after that, I'd say the biggest thing was that we didn't see Antoine Griezmann continue a level of form until the end of the season. And I think it was interesting in hearing Phil talk about the setup. He mentioned the two up front as Sørloth and Alvarez. He talked about Baena out wide. He talked about Giuliano Simeone on the right side, but there was no mention of Griezmann in there. And it's interesting that someone is going to have to take on the role. I think this is the biggest thing. For me, looking at this team, the most important thing that they don't do is have creators in the team. And it's interesting when you look at this transfer window, bring in Alex Baena, who had 10 assists for Villarreal last season, bring in Thiago Almada, who has a real creative streak as a young Argentinian player, even Ruggeri, the fullback that he mentioned from Atalanta, who was terrific creatively going down that left side for the side from Bergamo last season in Serie A. I think Simeone, spotting himself that the most important, they have so much industry, they have so much running. You can play your Coques, you can play your Pablo Barrios, players that will run to the end of the year. Rodrigo de Paul, obviously now on his way to Inter Miami, it seems like. You can talk about as many runners as you want. At this point, it has to be about creativity, passing from deep, passing in forward areas, and being creative higher up the pitch.
The perennial conversation about Diego Simeone at Atlético Madrid is, when is he finally going to end his time there? And from what we hear, it's when he decides he wants to end his time there. But is he capable of changing the way that this team plays? I mean, I know they adapt. I think it's perhaps a little bit unfair. And last season, we did see a bit of an adaptation because in the early years of his time at Atlético Madrid, it was horribly defensive. I mean, from the neutral perspective, it was like watching paint dry. You knew exactly what they were going to do, backed into a corner and just defend. They have been a little bit more attacking since that period, but is he capable of the rebuild that's potentially needed with that attacking focus to challenge Real Madrid and Barcelona?
I don't know. And I just don't know if he's the kind of guy that's going to change his stripes. He's been in this job for a long time, as you mentioned. And it's sort of interesting that we do talk about it as, when is he going to leave? Because there have been plenty of managers over the course of time that stayed at a club for a long while, and I think this is the Sir Alex Ferguson of Atlético Madrid. This is someone who's going to be here for the longer term. There's going to be a statue of him outside the ground. He's won things that they couldn't have dreamt of winning. He got to multiple Champions League finals. His resume is absolutely unquestionable, but I do not think that this is a manager who's all of a sudden going to figure out a way to coach like Guardiola or coach like Hansi Flick. He's his own guy. This is how he wants to go do it. The one thing that will be interesting is if all this new personnel that comes in, he decides, okay, I'm going to try and figure out how to play the 4-4-2 or whatever tactical setup to get all these guys on the pitch and get into great positions. And the second it goes wrong, what happens? Goes and brings back the runners, goes and brings back the team, the players in the team that have been there for him down the years, that have done the dogged defensive work. And in a big Champions League game, when they come up against, let's say, I don't know, Paris Saint-Germain, are they really going to go and attack them? I don't think so. I think this is ultimately, when it comes down to the biggest moments, he goes back to who he is.
Yeah, it's like the mafia boss that retreats to the compound when the pressure's on.
It's the agent in the movie that comes back to do one last job. And that's who he is. He's going to be that person for the rest of the time. So until proven otherwise, I don't think all of a sudden we're going to see those figures reverse and Atletico are going to be the side that score 102 goals next season. I just don't think that's who he is.